Good day. Today, 28th April, the military situation in Ukraine continues to develop in much the way that we have seen it do for the last couple of weeks, basically ever since the last stages of the Battle of Avdiivka back in February. In other words, further Russian advances, more signs of disorganization and collapse in terms of Ukrainian defenses, at least in the central part of the front lines, the ones around Avdiivka and now to the west of it, and further signs now of growing disarray on the part of Western governments, with some further very reckless and dangerous plans being floated, about which I shall turn to shortly. But firstly, let me start with that topic, the topic of that story, which I started my program with yesterday. Yesterday, I said that Igor Kimakovsky, a senior official in the Donetsk regional government, which is, of course, a government that is incorporated within the Russian Federation. It is not recognized as such by Western governments, but as far as the Russian authorities are concerned, Donetsk region and, of course, its government are part of the Russian Federation. Anyway, Igor Kimakovsky came forward and said that in the junction area between the village of Berdychi and the village of Semyonovka, to the northwest of Avdiivka, a Ukrainian military unit had been surrounded. Now, a short time later, a report appeared on Slavyangrad, which I discussed yesterday, which said that the commander of that unit was negotiating with the Russian authorities terms for its surrender. Then, a few hours later still, after I made my program, Radovka, a Russian newspaper published in Smolensk region, which I've discussed many times in these programs. It follows and tracks the war closely and has apparently either reporters on the ground or at least access to information from the ground. Anyway, it too confirmed that there were negotiations between this encircled unit and the Russian military authorities for its surrender, and Radovka said that it had obtained this information from multiple sources. And then this morning, I saw first a piece on Slavyangrad that also referred to such negotiations being underway, and then another report from a Russian reporter, a famous Russian military reporting project, and in fact, a extremely reliable one called War Gonzo, in which they said that this military unit has now, in fact, surrendered. So that's the information we've had. Of course, we've had no confirmation of any of this from the Ukrainians, and I have to also say that some Russian reporters or commentators have not been discussing the situation about the fighting and the surrender, the encirclement and surrender of this unit, this Ukrainian unit, in their various commentaries. Having said that, we have now had a fair amount of information. I'm going to suggest that what's probably happened is that the Russian authorities have given instructions that they do not want the discussion about the surrender of this unit to be discussed widely, probably because they were concerned that if such a thing were to happen, it would complicate the negotiations with the Ukrainian authorities in Kiev, probably trying to interfere with them by giving contrary orders to stand fast to the commander and to the unit that is negotiating or was negotiating for its surrender. That at least is my best take on this episode. We have not yet been provided with information about how large this unit is or how many troops are involved. The report on Slavyangrad yesterday suggested that it was a battalion, which would be several hundred men if it is up to strength. But anyway, we've not been provided with that information up to this point. What the Russian Defense Ministry has done today is that it has finally confirmed one of the military gains that we've been discussing over the last 2 weeks, and which the Russian military appear to have achieved. Now, we've had multiple reports from many sources. In fact, it's the overwhelming consensus of all the sources that the Russians have now captured the whole of Ocheretyne, this important village north of Avdiivka on the railway lines that is located on a hill. And we're also told that the Russian forces in Ocheretyne have actually advanced northwards towards another village called Arkhangelskoye, and that there is actually fighting going on in this other village. We're also told that the Russian military have captured the villages of Novobakhmutivka and Solovyova to the south of Ocheretyne, and over the last couple of hours, we've had reports from both Russian and Ukrainian sources that Berdychi and Semyonovka have also fallen under Russian control. In fact, the reports of the captures of all of these places have come from both Russian and Ukrainian sources, and this has been happening now for several days. There's also been commentaries, finally, about these events in some of the Western media. There's a piece, for example, in Forbes, which also speaks of fighting going on and of a collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Ocheretyne, though it gives the impression that fighting in Ocheretyne is still taking place. Well, the Russian Defense Ministry, up to today, has had nothing to say about any of this. Today, finally, they confirmed the capture of one of these villages that I've been speaking about, which is the village of Novobakhmutivka, which lies south of Ocheretyne. If you follow the Russian Defense Ministry's updates, they've been talking for some days now about fighting in all of these places, or near, as they always say, to all of these places. But Novobakhmutivka is the first place they've confirmed as fully captured. Now, that might mean that there is still fighting going on in Ocheretyne, on its northern outskirts, which is possible. Or it could be that the Russians are still combing through Ocheretyne, trying to find whether there are any Ukrainian stragglers or defenders still hiding, maybe in the basements or the basements of some of the houses or in some of the buildings in this village. And it's probably true that the Russians are also anyway clearing the village of the kind of mines and booby traps that Ukrainian armies, soldiers often leave behind them when they retreat from a particular location. It's also probably true that if the Russians have indeed reached the northern part of Ocheretyne and have secured it, which is what the Ukrainian sources have been telling us, that they're still coming under fire from Ukrainian troops further north, perhaps in Arkhangelskoye, which the Russians are said to be attacking. It is not unusual for the Russian Defense Ministry to take its time to confirm that a particular place has been captured and secured. Probably the fact that the Defense Ministry has now confirmed that Novobakhmutivka has now been captured is a sign that Russian control over Novobakhmutivka is not only complete, but stable, and that Russian troops are able to move around this village without, all parts of this village, without any risk. Nonetheless, for what it's worth, it's important to remember that Novobakhmutivka remains the only place that the Russian Defense Ministry itself says has been captured. More likely, in fact, overwhelmingly likely, Ocheretyne, Novobakhmutivka, Solovyova, Berdychi, and Semyonivka are all under Russian Russian military control. As I said in my program yesterday, I expect that at some point over the next few days, Defense Minister Shoigu will deliver a detailed report about what is happening to Putin himself, and all of it will be published on the Kremlin's website. And then we will have final confirmation of all of these gains. Anyway, that's one piece of information that has come through. We have had other information about other fighting taking place elsewhere in this area. So there are reports that Ukrainian troops are withdrawing from Novokalinovo. This is a village to the east of Ocheretyne, with the Russians apparently in control of Ocheretyne and probably attacking Arkhangelskoye to the north. The Ukrainian defenders of Novokalinovo are now at serious risk of becoming encircled, and it appears that they are withdrawing from the village and are pulling back towards Arkhangelskoye itself. There are, however, reports which contradict the claims that were appearing yesterday, that Keramik, the village that lies immediately to the north of Novokalinovo, has been captured, fully captured. It seems, at least according to the very latest reports, that this village is indeed largely under Russian control, but it also seems that an elite Ukrainian Special Forces unit, apparently called the White Wolves, is still there. Supposedly, it's been encircled by the Russians, and anyway, fighting involving that unit is still underway. I have to say, if this is true, and again, it apparently is confirmed by multiple sources, then it is very interesting that the Ukrainians rushed an elite special forces unit to this particular village. It might be a sign, a further sign, of how bad, indeed catastrophic, the whole situation is becoming, and that they felt that they needed to send an elite special forces unit in order to try to stem what is rapidly developing into an outright rout. Anyway, what we see is that if this special forces unit was sent in that sort of way, then according to the very latest reports, all that has happened is that it has become trapped and is likely soon to be submerged in the Russian flood. So anyway, a dramatic series of events. A report I saw earlier today on Slavyangrad suggests that there are something like 3,500 Ukrainian troops now close to being trapped in this salient between Novokalinova and Keramik to the east and Ocheretyne to the west, and that with the Russians able to shell all the main roads in this area, and with their drones and aircraft operating as well. There's some reports that Russian helicopter gunships are also active in this area. Anyway, with all of those, with all that information, it seems that pulling these troops back, these 3,500 troops, if that is the true number, is going to be extremely difficult. And it's far from certain that it can be done, or at least that it can be done without very heavy losses being incurred. Now, that would suggest, by the way, that something like 2 brigades are trapped, or at least not quite trapped, but under some kind of operational encirclement by the Russians in this salient. However, that's only one report, and as one can see, this is a very fluid and dynamic situation. So, very bad situation on this front, and apparently an equally bad situation, a rapidly developing and worsening situation in the town of Krasnohorivka to the southwest of Avdiivka, to be precise. There, it seems the fighting is now continuing very much in the favor of the Russians. The Russians now control, according to most reports, more than 50% of Krasnohorivka. And in fact, they don't just control 50% plus of Krasnohorivka. They control the more defendable parts of it. Apparently, they've captured the industrial area. I discussed this yesterday. And they've also captured some of the high-rise buildings. And the buildings that lie beyond the high-rise buildings are low-rise buildings, cottages and residential buildings of that kind, which would be extremely difficult to defend. And if that's correct, and I don't again see any reason to doubt this, then it's likely that Krasnohorivka will fall probably within the next few days. And when I say the next few days, probably over the course of the coming week. That's a guess on my part. Maybe I'm not the best or most reliable person to make these guesses, but so it looks to me. Again, there are comments about how it will be difficult to extract the Ukrainian troops still in Krasnohorivka and to withdraw them to more secure positions. And given the chaos, the developing chaos and disorganization of the Ukrainian forces in this part of Donbass, it's not certain anyway where those more secure and defendable positions would actually be. Now, there are reports, and again it's Dima at the Military Summary Channel who's discussed them most elaborately, that the Russians are sending a further 10,000 troops. That would suggest a reinforced division, or if you prefer, 3 brigades of troops to the Avdiivka Ocheretyne area with the intention of developing the success, reinforcing and intensifying the offensive. So, well, I've discussed previously that the Russians probably have had relatively light losses in these operations that have been playing out over the last few weeks. They are heavily backed by their air force and by their extremely powerful artillery. They're able to use armoured forces increasingly over the harder ground, which has enabled them also, I suspect, to limit their losses. And with 10,000 fresh troops, it looks as if they do intend to continue their offensive. Be interesting to see, at least I will personally be interested to see, how they address whatever logistic issues are involved in continuing to mount an offensive, which is now moving a significant distance beyond the Russians' major supply points in Donetsk city. But anyway, that's doubtless an issue for the Russians themselves to work out. Anyway, there we go. So major problems for the Ukrainians. Well, problems is an understatement, as we'll see signs of panic and crisis beginning to emerge. And again, there's speculation that after the fall of Krasnohorivka, the Russians will push on towards Kurakovo and will be seeking to capture Kurakovo, cutting off the supply lines to Vuhledar in the south. And of course, if they capture Ocheretyne, well, Dima at the Military Summary Channel, who has perhaps who definitely has a better tactical grasp of the situation than I do, he has, I think, basically come round to the view that the most likely action of the Russians will be to pivot northwest from Ocheretyne to advance to capture Arkhangelskoye, obviously, and then to move further north and pivot somewhat eastwards, outflanking the Ukrainian forces in Toretsk and New York. This is an important defense position that the Ukrainians established in 2014. And anyway, to outflank the Ukrainian forces there and ultimately to move towards the town of Konstantinovka. This is the town to the west of Chasiv Yar, which the Russians are also in the process of attacking. And that would suggest a very major operation, the biggest encirclement operation that the Russians have so far attempted during this war, potentially creating a very big cauldron for the Ukrainian forces in Toretsk and New York if they don't withdraw in time, and perhaps also a further cauldron if they do indeed mount an attack on Konstantinovka from the southwest at the same time as they are advancing to Konstantinovka from the northeast via Chasiv Yar, which they are attacking at the present time. And just to perhaps develop on Dima's ideas, there's been much discussion about what Russian tactics are in Chasiv Yar. The Russians seem to be steadily improving their position, as they like to say, around Chasiv Yar, taking strategic positions around Chasiv Yar. They have effectively, as I've said already, encircled the micro-district to the east of the canal. They're positioning themselves so that they can cross the canal in various places. But so far, as many have commented, despite the intense activity of the Russian Air Force over Chasiv Yar and the relentless shelling that is taking place of Chasiv Yar, the Russians haven't mounted a storming operation of the entire town. They haven't yet attempted to storm the micro-district, and they certainly haven't yet attempted to storm Chasiv Yar itself. Perhaps they're waiting for the southern pincer, if that's what it is, the one that's collecting around Ocheretyne, to develop so that it can then advance and put itself in a position where it can attack Konstantinovka, so that Konstantinovka and, by the way, Chasiv Yar come under attack from multiple directions, making it all but impossible for the Ukrainians to reinforce their positions and to stabilize their front there. Be, as I said, an ambitious operation, one that, well, I'm not remotely competent to say how realistic it is, but perhaps that is the Russian plan, and perhaps that's what they intend and are going to do. Anyway, a further sign of how this policy of aggressive attrition that the Russians have been conducting, putting mounting pressure on the Ukrainians at multiple points along the front line, but now especially perhaps increasing pressure in the Avdiivka area, but also in other places. A further sign of the effect that this is having is shown by the way in which the Ukrainians have apparently had to rush reinforcements, not to plug the hole in Avdiivka, but to try to anticipate a Russian advance that might cause another hole to appear, and that is further south in the Novomikhailivka area. Now, the Russians captured this village about a week ago, or at least the capture of this village was finally confirmed about a week ago. There's reports that they're fighting in Paraskovyevka, the village immediately to the west of Novomikhailivka, and there's reports that the Russians are also attacking the larger village of Konstantinovka, which must not be confused with the town of Konstantinovka to the west of Chasiv Yar. Anyway, the Russians are said to be attacking this village as well. And again, of course, if these two villages fall, the way opens to Kurakhovo, at the same time as the Russians would be able to push towards Kurakhovo from Krasnohorivka. When it falls, cutting off supplies to the key fortress town further south of Vuhledar. And the Ukrainians have had to redeploy two brigades to this area. One is the 116th Brigade, which has been sent there from Zaporozhye region, where fighting, by the way, continues around that endlessly contested village of Rabotino in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. And also, perhaps more importantly, another brigade has had to be redeployed to this area from the Chasiv Yar sector. So Ukrainian defenses in Chasiv Yar are being weakened by the need to stop further Russian advances towards what is now increasingly looking like the next key city, key town rather, to be targeted after Krasnohorivka, which is Kurakhovo. Well, there we are, an escalating, accelerating crisis, with the Ukrainians having to shuffle brigades from one part of the front line to another, even as the Russians have just demonstrated that they're in a position to reinforce their success in the one part of the front line the Avdiivka area, where it looks like they've already achieved a major breakthrough. Now, I spoke about a mood of panic, and we have had a comment about this from Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. Now, he said yesterday that on the Ukrainian side, the panic is growing on the front line. And this is first-hand information that there, on that side, the panic is growing. It is very important for us now to maintain this dynamic. It is very important not to stop and continue fulfilling the tasks of the special military operation. Now, Peskov said that in an interview carried on the Moscow Kremlin-Putin television program, which is hosted by Pavel Zarubin. Pavel Zarubin is Putin's favorite television reporter. It is with Zarubin that Putin conducts many of his most important interviews. And this television program, Moscow Kremlin Putin, as one might assume from its title, seems to have some kind of semi-official quality. In other words, it looks like a joint project by the Kremlin and Pavel Zarubin himself. Now, notice what Peskov is saying. He says that the panic is growing on the front line, and this is first-hand information. So the Ukrainians are panicking, and the Russians have first-hand information about this. This is information that the Russians are getting from their troops on the front line, and which is being reported to the Kremlin itself. But then Peskov goes on to say it is very important for us now to maintain this dynamic. It is very important not to stop and to continue fulfilling the tasks of the special military operation. That's a direct quote, and I'm getting all this, by the way, from the official Russian news agency TASS. So what Peskov is saying is that the Russians are not going to stop, pause, slow down, consolidate, do any of these things. They sense that they have the Ukrainians in this area on the ropes, and that the moment has therefore come not to slacken off or ease off, but to continue hitting. And in other words, to continue the offensive, the ongoing offensive that is developing in the Avdiivka Ocheretyne area. Well, that's Peskov, but we've had something fairly similar from the other side, if you like, and that's from General Syrsky, the military commander of Ukraine's forces, recently appointed in replacement of General Zaluzhny. And Syrsky, who has in the past made all sorts of very optimistic claims on behalf of the Ukrainians, which have not turned out to be true. I still remember, for example, how back in the summer, he claimed that the Ukrainians had brought the whole of Bakhmut back under their fire control, which was obviously and completely and even absurdly untrue. Anyway, Syrsky now is saying publicly that the situation on the front lines is becoming increasingly difficult. He speaks of the Ukrainians being under very heavy pressure. He's obviously choosing his words carefully, but one senses that he also recognizes an operational crisis developing. So Peskov talks about panic. Syrsky doesn't, of course, use that word, but in a sense, Peskov's words and Syrsky's words complement each other. The Russians are scenting blood and are pushing hard. The Ukrainians are, by contrast, struggling and, well, based on what I have seen, the reports I have seen over the last few weeks, I don't think that Peskov is overstating things when he says that there is signs of panic. For anyone who doubts that, comments that are appearing on the Twitter X threads and in the Telegram channels of various Ukrainian commentators and Ukrainian soldiers, well, they tell their own story. They show gathering anger and growing stress and alarm at a rapidly deteriorating situation. Now, as I always do in these latest series of programs, focused on what's going on in the Avdiivka Ocheretyne area, because clearly this is the most important. I think we can now treat Krasnohorivka, the battle that is shaping up there, as part of this area as well. However, it's important to stress again that this is not the area where the Russians are pressing. They're pressing in the Vremivka salient, where they seem to be attacking and seeking to capture this village of Ocheretyne, which was such an important village in Ukraine's counteroffensive of the summer. I remember when the Ukrainians reported its capture, this was greeted as a triumphant moment by many in the West. And the Russians continue to slog it out with the Ukrainians in Zaporozhye, in Rabotino and Verbovoye. And the last time I looked at a map in this area, it did seem to me that Bradley Square, the area that the Ukrainians carved out, sort of salient that they'd carved out in this area over the course of the summer offensive, that has shrunk considerably. But anyway, the Russians are clearly pushing the Ukrainians hard there. But there's now some evidence that they're reactivating their front in other places. So it looks as if the Russians have indeed launched a serious attack on the village of Kislovka in the Kupyansk area. Some maps that have been published seem to show significant Russian advances in this area. They appear to control now perhaps the greater part of Kislovka. If they capture Kislovka, another village next to it, which lies close to it, Katlerova, presumably will fall quickly as well. That potentially opens the way for further advances towards the Oskol River further west. The Oskol River is, of course, the river that runs northward, that runs through Kupyansk. There's part of Kupyansk east of the Oskol River, and there's another part of Kupyansk, the more residential part of Kupyansk, which lies to the west of the Oskol River. So a sudden burst of activity by the Russians in this area as well. And, well, this morning there were claims, they're not the first time that this has been claimed, by the way, but there were claims that the Russians further south in the area of the Jerebets River have now captured a village called Makeyevka. And the point about the capture of this village is that it then opens the way for an attack on Terny from the north, that the Russians can push southwards from Makeyevka, despite many claims that the Ukrainians were going to push the Russians back from the positions that the Russians have established close to Terny, east of the Jerebets River. That doesn't seem to have happened. But if Makeyevka has indeed fallen, the Russians would be in a position to attack Terny from two directions, from the north and from the east. And at that point, I suspect the battle for Terny would become unsustainable and the Ukrainians would have to retreat. I'm a little bit cautious about this claim because I vividly remember that some weeks ago there were reports floating around that the Russians had captured Makeyevka, only it turned out not to be the case. But who knows? Perhaps this time those reports are true. And elsewhere on the front lines, also more reports that the Russians are now attacking more places in the Syrsky area. They're launching attacks on a village called Sporny, bitterly contested village, once captured by the Russians, recaptured by the Ukrainians, a bit like Belogorovka further north, one of those villages that has been fought over and leveled many times. And there's also reports that the Russians are fighting inside yet another village in this area called Krasnohorivka, even as they push up a railway line towards Vimka, a railway station south of Syrsky, and seek to occupy various villages to the west of Syrsky. Ukrainians holding on, clinging on to their positions around Syrsky, probably suffering significant losses, being shelled and bombed by the Russians all the time. This is not yet, or so it seems to me, a major battlefront, but it has the possibilities of becoming one fairly soon. So, pressure on the Ukrainians mounting, claims from Peskov that the Ukrainians are showing sign of panic. The news from Avdiivka and Ocheretyne area suggests why they might indeed be panicking. And comments from none other than General Syrsky, which, though they don't exactly confirm panic, do suggest a serious operational crisis, of which panic is quite likely a part. So a very bad situation. And, well, we continue to read all kinds of claims. I think there was another one, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, that with the new military aid package, the Ukrainians might not be able to stop the Russians entirely, but would be able to blunt their offensive. Again, I have to say this, I think that people who talk in that way are not really attending closely to the events on the front lines. There, it seems to me that the situation is so bad that the latest military aid package has already been overtaken by events. It is, after all, no more, not as big as aid packages that Ukraine has received in the past. Now, on the question of that aid package, the $1 billion aid package which Ukraine has just received, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has, I understand, done a further analysis of it, a breakdown of it and a discussion of it. He is the person to explain and to discuss what these aid packages mean best. I've not yet had the time to watch this program. I intend to do so urgently as a matter of interest, and I would urge everyone else to do so as well. And we'll probably get from Brian, as we always do, a clearer sense of where all this is going. Now, a major crisis on the battlefronts. There are all sorts of plans, schemes, perhaps I should say, floating around about what Ukraine should do in this accelerating situation of gradually developing collapse. I don't think that is overstating things. Bear in mind that all of this is happening without the new group of forces north, apparently under the command of General Lapin, so far being activated in any serious way. We've not seen any evidence of this big Russian offensive that so many people have been talking about, and yet already the situation is deteriorating and deteriorating fast. So all kinds of schemes about what to do, and I've discussed them in various programs on this channel, and we've discussed them on the Duran, plans to pull back to the Dnieper, plans to fall back into the Iron Triangle of towns, this fortified area that has been created around the Dnieper, Krivoy Rog, Zaporozhye and Dnipro, plans to deploy possibly European troops to Ukraine, a disastrous and misguided idea if ever there was one. But there does appear to be one immediate plan, which is to supply Ukraine with long-range missiles and use those missiles to engage the Russians in missile strikes. Now, the missiles that we most hear about are the ATACMS missiles. And today, in that same military update, in which the Russians confirmed the capture of Novobakhmutivka, they make another very remarkable claim. They claim that in the latest strikes that the Ukrainians tried to launch against Russian positions, presumably on Crimea, the Russians shot down 5 ATACMS missiles. 5 ATACMS missiles shot down presumably over the course of a single missile strike. Now, up to this point, I have not heard of any Ukrainian missiles impacting on any Russian target. That may be because even though this information about this ATACMS missile strike is some hours old, it could be that we just haven't had the reports yet of the missile strike, and it's possible that some ATACMS missiles got through and that some damage was done. But on the face of it, the Russians are saying that they've shot down 5 ATACMS missiles, and again, on the face of it, that would imply that the Russians have shot down all of the ATACMS missile strikes that took part in this particular strike. This is supposition. It may not be true, but we'll just have to see. I noticed that a US military official yesterday, perhaps after the failure of this latest missile strike, made comments about the fact that the Russian air defense system was one of the most effective and resilient in the world. Maybe the US has noticed that because of the failure of this ATACMS strike. But if this is all correct, if the Russians have indeed shot down 5 ATACMS missiles, and if they did indeed shoot down 10 ATACMS missiles a week ago, in conjunction with the attack on the Jankoy base, and if they did indeed shoot down 3 more ATACMS missiles being fired, which was being launched towards Crimea, they did indeed shoot them down over the Black Sea, then that would imply that the Russians have shot down, well, at the higher end, 18, at the lower end, maybe 15 ATACMS missiles over the last 2 weeks. Now, some ATACMS missiles did indeed get through during the attack on the Jankoy base, the air base in Crimea. A reasonable guess is that the total number of those was 5, but it still looks as if the ATACMS, if we believe what the Russians are saying, is not performing especially well. There might be further reason to believe that the ATACMS is disappointing. There's been a number of comments from another senior US official. I believe, by the way, that he was a Undersecretary of State in the Department of Defense, but I'm not absolutely sure about this, but about what he said, there is no doubt. He admitted that the small diameter bomb, this is this cobbled together system. It's a bomb that has been combined with a rocket and which has been designed to be launched from the HIMARS system. It has a longer range than the HIMARS rockets that had previously been supplied to Ukraine. It works on the basis that the rocket fires, is launched at a certain point. The bomb, which is the warhead, becomes detached from the rocket and glides down to the target. There's been much to talk about this system. It was heavily trailed as being a breakthrough system when it was first mooted. Anyway, this official has said that it has proved ineffective. Russian jamming technology has been largely successful in countering the effectiveness of this small diameter bomb. And, well, it's not had the effect that was expected on the battlefronts. And I wonder whether that admission wasn't perhaps timed in conjunction with some doubts that are now beginning to take hold about the success, or rather failure, of the ATACMS missiles, the ATACMS missile. If these claims by the Russians to have shot down at least 15 of them are true. Now, I say all of this because it's absolutely clear that the ATACMS has been given a very significant role in the latest arms package. And I'm talking now not just about the package that was sent covertly in March. I'm talking about the larger arms package, the one that has just been authorized by Congress. And it's clear to me that one of the major purposes by the United States of supplying Ukraine with ATACMS missiles was to enable Ukraine to attack and destroy the Crimean bridge. This has now become the major target. We could already see signs of this, that Western focus was shifting towards helping Ukraine to destroy the Crimean bridge. We could see that in the discussions that took place between those 4 German generals discussing the Taurus missile, which the Russians intercepted and published to the intense embarrassment of the German government. Now, the German generals, over the course of that discussion, spoke about the difficulty of destroying the Crimean bridge. They suggested that it would take perhaps 20 Taurus missiles in a single strike to achieve that effect. The Taurus missile has not so far been supplied to Ukraine. I wonder whether, given the obsession with destroying the Crimean bridge, the United States finally had enough and decided that since the Germans were dragging their feet with the supply of the Taurus missiles, the US would do that which it had previously said it would not do, which is supply Ukraine with the ATACMS missiles, so that the ATACMS missiles could be used to destroy the Crimean bridge instead. Now, I suspect that we're going to see a major attempt to destroy the Crimean bridge. These missile strikes with the ATACMS missiles that have been going on up to now appear to me to be, so far, rather unsuccessful tests of these missiles. And there are rumors that a major missile strike on the Crimean bridge is slated to happen in the first half of May. Now, May is an important period in Russia's political calendar. On the 7th of May, President Putin is re-inaugurated president of Russia. On the 9th of May, Russia celebrates Victory Day, which is the major public celebration in Russia. Earlier, on the 3rd and 4th of May, Russians celebrate the Orthodox Easter. So, with the situation on the battlefronts going from bad to worse, why not try to spoil the party and the mood by destroying the Crimean bridge? It seems to me completely logical. You then divert attention again from what's actually happening on the battlefronts and focus on destroying the Crimean bridge. There might be another reason, by the way, why the decision has been made to go after the Crimean bridge now. To be clear, destroying the Crimean bridge would serve no military purpose. Even the German generals admitted as much. The bridge apparently has ceased to have a logistical role for the Russian military for some time. Russian military supplies to Crimea now go there via the land bridge, which the Russians have carved out in Zaporozhye and Kherson region. As we've heard many times, the Russians have built a railway system. It's not clear when that system will come into full operation, but it's likely to be fairly soon. For all I know, it's happened already, and it could be that the Russians are already sending supplies via the railway into Crimea. But anyway, even the German generals admitted that destroying the Crimean bridge is not going to affect Russian logistic operations. But it would be a major event, and it would be something that would certainly attract attention, not just in Russia and in Ukraine, but around the world. And we could have all the usual articles and headlines in the newspapers talking about how Putin had been humiliated by the destruction of his bridge at around the time when he is once again being inaugurated president. Now, all of that, however, brings us back to the question of why the bridge has not been attacked previously, why the United States and the Western powers have dragged their heels and resisted Ukrainian demands in the past to attack the Crimean bridge. Now, this brings me to the question of why the attack is suddenly being considered now. And I have wondered whether there might be some connection to the probable plan, which is for Ukraine ultimately to retreat its forces to withdraw its forces to the west bank of the Dnieper, basically surrendering the eastern part of Ukraine east of the Dnieper, to the Russians. Now, I say that because one of the great mysteries, one of the great enigmas of this war, one that I constantly get people writing to me about, by the way, is why haven't the Russians attacked the bridges across the Dnieper River? These are the bridges that Ukraine uses to keep its forces in eastern Ukraine supplied. If the bridges are destroyed, the Ukrainian forces on the east bank of the Dnieper, those fighting in Kharkiv and Donbass, are to all intents and purposes cut off and cannot be supplied, and the war would end on the eastern bank relatively fast. I mean, there would still be presumably some fighting, but eventually these Ukrainian armies would not be able to sustain themselves and would be forced, presumably, to surrender. Well, I wonder, and I've been wondering about this for some time, whether there hasn't been some kind of quiet understanding between the Western powers and the Russians, specifically the Americans and the Russians, that the Russians would not attack the Dnieper bridges if the Americans did not allow an attack upon the Crimean bridge. The implicit threat being that if the Crimean bridge were destroyed, then the Russians would retaliate by destroying the Dnieper bridges. Now, I say that, I recall that when the topic of the Russians destroying the Dnieper bridges was first discussed in the autumn of 2022, there were all sorts of knowledgeable people coming forward and saying that the Russians weren't attacking the Dnieper bridges because they lacked the means to do it, that the KH-101 missiles were not powerful enough to destroy these massive bridges across the Dnieper, that it would have required multiple strikes with many missiles to do serious damage to one of these bridges, which was, I'm sure, true, and that the bridges could not therefore be destroyed as easily as people said. I have never questioned this, but I have always said that I still thought that despite all of these very real problems in destroying the bridges, the Russians almost certainly could destroy the bridges if they put their mind to do it. Kinjal missiles, with their tremendous kinetic energy and their tremendous power, could probably inflict very significant damage on the Dnieper bridges as well, as would, by the way, ground-launched Iskander-M missiles. The colossal KH-22-32 anti-ship missiles designed by the Russians to destroy aircraft carriers and very successfully used by the Russians in the area of the special military operation, could, if they struck a bridge, also, in my opinion, do massive damage, almost certainly causing the bridge's destruction. There's been some questions about the accuracy of these missiles, but it seems to me that in their latest variant, the KH-32, they probably do have the sufficient accuracy. And of course, beyond that, now the Russians can supplement any attack on the Dnieper bridges by their Kinjals and their KH-22-32s with bombs, with heavy precision-guided bombs, Fab 1500s, and perhaps before long, Fab 3000s, and of course also if they were to decide to do it, Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles, though I'm less sure what exact damage those would do. So anyway, one way or the other, I think the Russians could destroy the bridges. Perhaps it would have been difficult for them in the autumn of 2022, but as quantities of Kinjal missiles have increased, and of that there is no doubt, as FAB precision-guided bombs have entered service in huge numbers and have grown in size and power, I've no doubt that they could do it. So maybe someone in Washington has now come to the decision that since there is indeed a plan to dig in west of the Dnieper and to write off eastern Ukraine, the time has now come to destroy the Crimean bridge. There is, of course, an obvious objection, which is that doing such a thing would in effect sacrifice the existing Ukrainian army east of the Dnieper. But I have to say, the decision-making in Washington is now taking on what is, for me, an increasingly disturbing and very ruthless calculus. Specifically, I now have read, I believe again it was in the Washington Post, that the Ukrainians finally passed their mobilization law, their recent mobilization law, reducing the age at which Ukrainian men can be mobilized to 25 at the insistence of the United States, at the insistence of the Biden administration. So it looks as if the United States, instead of even contemplating negotiations, is not only micromanaging the war, but is pushing the Ukrainians increasingly into actions which the Ukrainians themselves are unhappy about taking and which can only lead to major, massive losses on the part of Ukraine at a time when it is universally acknowledged that the country is already in a demographic crisis. Now, I have to say this, I don't like to say this, but I have to say this, that it seems to me that people who are prepared to make these kind of ruthless decisions seem to be people who probably would not balk at taking steps like attacking the Crimean bridge, which would massively embarrass President Putin, or so they might think, even if the price, the ultimate price for such a thing, were paid by Ukraine. Well, I'm going to say that this makes me even more anxious that the Russians are successful in shooting these missiles, these ATACMS missiles down. Because I accept the idea that the Russians might come after the Dnieper bridges if the Crimean bridge is destroyed is purely a guess on my part, and I might be wrong about that. There might be other reasons why the Russians are keeping those bridges open. But if I am right, despite the fact that it might prolong the war, I still would not want to see tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops casually abandoned and sacrificed in that way. Now, I'm probably going to get pushback from all sorts of people about this. They will no doubt say that I got it all wrong. But anyway, we will see what happens. Anyway, let's keep careful track of this. What I will say is what I've said before. I doubt that this military package, which we've seen from the United States, is going to make any significant difference to the development of the fighting on the battlefront. Certainly Peskov doesn't seem to think so. The most useful weapon, the weapon that the Ukrainians need most at the present time, is air defense equipment, missiles and such systems. The United States has apparently ruled out supplying any more Patriot systems of its own. It says that it has none to spare. It's demanding that its European allies surrender even more of their systems in its own place. We've seen that these systems, the Patriot in particular, but all the others too, don't appear to have any ability to intercept hypersonic missiles like the Zircon and the Kinzhal, which the Russians are increasingly using, and that the Russians have been able to destroy them in significant numbers. With the West unable to resolve Ukraine's air defense problems, it seems to me that sending a few more Javelins and Stingers, 12 old, apparently mechanically unreliable Bradleys. The Ukrainians are complaining that the Bradleys are not particularly effective. Sending more systems of the HIMARS missiles, missile launchers, which the Russians have also been destroying, and for which the small diameter bombs have been a failure. Well, none of that, it seems to me, is going to change the situation on the battlefronts in any significant way. And as we see, Peskov at least appears to think that the Russians are in a position of decisive advantage. And it looks as if, for the moment, Syrsky agrees with him. So anyway, let's wait and see what happens. I'm going to suggest that the next couple of weeks are going to be extremely fraught. Firstly, we need to see what the Russians do in the Avdiivka, Ocheretyne, Krasnohorivka area. What they also do, perhaps in Kharkiv, they have been destroying Ukraine's electrical power generating systems. The Ukrainians have continued their ineffective attacks on Russian oil refineries, by the way. They attacked and did some damage to one refinery yesterday. The Russians are now putting nets and other things, protective systems around their refineries, and I suspect that these will have an effect as well. Anyway, all of that is happening on the actual battlefronts. But it does look as if the US has decided, or at least the Biden administration, has decided to go for broke with an attack on the Crimean bridge. And we will see how that plays out and whether, if it succeeds, it has the catastrophic consequences that I've outlined in this program. Now, let's move to other topics. The first topic I want to discuss is, again, I want to come back to these very difficult meetings between the Chinese and the Secretary of State Blinken, who has recently been to Beijing. Many people have commented on the fact that after his astonishingly provocative press statement, Secretary Blinken was seen off from the airport by only one official, who it turns out was the US ambassador to China. In other words, the Chinese stayed away. There is a film circulating, which, well, it's clearly original, which shows a sour-looking Xi Jinping wandering around in a large room prior to the meeting with Blinken and asking an aide, rather pointedly, when is Blinken due to leave? Now, that might have been just a question. It might have been that Xi Jinping wanted that information. But the appearance of this film suggested, at least to me, that Xi Jinping was absolutely not looking forward to his meeting with Blinken, not at all, and was keen to see him out of China as quickly as possible. Now, what is even more remarkable about that film is not just its content, but the fact that it has been published at all. Now, I cannot imagine that that was done without a decision to that effect by the Chinese authorities. And I wonder whether the publication of that film, together with the absence of any Chinese officials from Blinken's departure from the airport on the occasion of Blinken's departure, weren't intended to signal that the Chinese have finally had as much of Blinken as they can take, and that briefly he is no longer welcome in their country. If I'm right about that, and I can't myself see what other interpretation there can be, then that demonstrates the extent to which the relationship between China and the United States has now collapsed. Well, Blinken, just a few months ago at the San Francisco summit meeting, was being represented as the moderate, the man who wanted the dialogue between China and the United States to resume, the man who was upset when President Biden again referred to President Xi as a dictator. Well, I remember all that commentary and all that discussion taking place at that time, that the difficulties Blinken was having, basically reining in the old man, in other words, the president himself. Well, after what has happened, I doubt that the Chinese themselves think that anymore. I don't know to what extent the administration understands the damage that has been done in the relationship with China. I wonder whether American business leaders, Apple, for example, which relies so heavily on China for its ongoing production, I can't imagine that they're happy with the way things have gone. But I'm afraid, and I'm sorry to say it, I think that even if some members of the administration perhaps underestimate the damage that has been done, I think that others probably welcome it and are probably happy to see it happen, and that they are now pressing for even more. Just saying. Anyway, the other piece of news that I've seen, but it's important to stress that this is only rumours for the moment, is that the ICC might be preparing finally to publish indictments and presumably arrest warrants against senior Israeli leaders, including apparently the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Netanyahu, and the defense minister of Israel, Mr. Gantz, in connection with the events in Gaza. Well, if that does happen, then to say that this will be embarrassing for the Biden administration and for European governments, especially the governments of Britain and Germany above all, would be an understatement. I think they would hit the roof. I think they'll be furious if such a thing happens. They've backed the ICC's indictment and arrest warrant against President Putin. They've been telling countries around the world that that arrest warrant must be respected if President Putin ever arrives in their countries. How do they walk that back in connection with Israel if indictments and arrest warrants are issued against Israeli officials? How do they receive Prime Minister Netanyahu in their own countries? I would have thought that Western governments, if there is any truth to this news, are going to move heaven and earth to try to persuade the ICC not to go forward with this step. If the ICC does, and if these rumours are really true, then it would show how much damage to its credibility the ICC has suffered because of its failure up to now to take any step with respect to the situation in Gaza, and the fact that it has to take this, frankly, desperate step, well, they will see it as a desperate step, in order to restore their credibility in consequence. But I am not sure that this rumour is true, and even if it is, as I said, I'm sure that the pressure to reverse it is enormous, and we will just have to wait and see. Anyway, this is where I finish my programme today. More from me soon. Let me just repeat again, I think the next couple of weeks are going to be very important in this war. We will see, first of all, whether there is an attack on the Crimean bridge and how successful it is, and what the Russians do in response. And we now have what is looking like an unstoppable, irreversible crisis for Ukraine on the battlefronts. For the moment, Western governments are just about controlling the information flow. But if the situation is as bad as it looks, which I believe it is, then at some point over the next few weeks, we're going to see panic break out on a scale that we have not seen up to now. Anyway, a difficult few weeks ahead, but this is where I end my video. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of amazing things, including a series that, in fact, by coincidence, commemorates or celebrates an event taking place on the 9th of May. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.